The following story takes place between the years 793 and 927 AD. What you're about to watch is the third episode of our series on the history of England, specifically the second one focusing on the Middle Ages. If this sounds confusing, perhaps it's because you haven't watched the first two videos, which we recommend you do now. If, however, you are already up to speed or you simply like your history a little bit messy, then you're in for a treat because medieval England is totally chaotic. So, without further ado, let's get on with it. We pick up this story in the same place we left it at the end of the last episode, the sacking of Lindisfarne Monastery by the Vikings. Although this was not their first attack on record, it is the one that marks the start of the invasion of Anglo-Saxon lands by these Scandinavian peoples. Throughout the following years, this situation would be repeated over and over again. The Vikings would arrive with no prior warning, raid monasteries and coastal towns, take anything of value, kidnap or kill everyone they came across, and then disappear as fast as they came.
They are some sneaky bastards.
But what were the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms doing while all these attacks took place? Well, when we last saw them, the Kingdom of Mercia, under King Cornwall, controlled all the central and southern parts, while Northumbria, led by King Edmund, held sway over the north. But this precarious balance of power, which had been pretty shaky even at the best of times, was starting to fall apart, and so the Anglo-Saxons were quite busy with their own internal squabbles. The year 825 brought the end of Mercia's supremacy, marked by the Battle of Ellendum, at which the Mercian troops of Beowulf were defeated by the army of Wessex, led by King Ecgberht. This king is very important from a historical standpoint, as he is considered to be the founding member of the current British royal family. Can you see the resemblance?
Identical.
Under him, Wessex was reborn and went on to conquer Mercia for many years, as well as Essex, Sussex and Kent definitively. He even took over Cornwall, and thanks to all these conquests, Wessex became the most powerful kingdom in England. Now let's have a quick look at the state of the other British nations. First we'll travel north to sunny Scotland, where the fierce Picts dominated most of the land through a confederation known as Fortru. That is, until the arrival of a guy named Kenneth McAlpin, but better known as Kenneth. He was the ruler of Riata, a small Goidelic kingdom of the Scotai tribe, located in the Hebrides, an archipelago off the western coast of Scotland. King Kenneth went on a conquering spree and ended up taking over most of Scotland, founding the Kingdom of Alba in 843, which soon afterwards would become the Kingdom of Scotland. In fact, the Scottish people generally consider Kenneth as the first King of Scotland.
Scotland?
Meanwhile, further south, the territory of Wales was divided into several petty kingdoms. That means small, not pedantic. Here we must highlight the role of King Rhodri the Great, ruler of Gwynned and Powys, who would later proclaim himself King of all Britons when he expelled the Vikings from his domains. After his death, his kingdom was divided among his children, of whom the best known was Annexing, heir of Gwynned.
But where is this place?
Back in England, King Ecgberht of Wessex died in 839 and was succeeded by his son Æthelwulf, who had to defend the land against periodic Viking attacks but managed to keep them more or less in check. King Æthelwulf in turn was succeeded by his own children, and yes, that's children in plural. First was Æthelwold, who died after just 2 years and had barely enough time to marry his own stepmother, but not enough time to have any heirs. Therefore, the crown went to his brother Æthelbert, but he didn't last very long either, just 5 years, and was also childless.
Being king is exhausting.
So finally it was the turn of the third brother, Æthelred I, who managed not to die so quickly and became quite an important figure, but we'll come back to him later. First we need to get up to speed with the other side of the brewing conflict, the Vikings, who had been conducting increasingly violent raids until, in 865, they finally decided to get down to serious business and prepare a large-scale invasion with the goal of relocating to England from their Danish homeland. This force was known as the Great Heathen Army and was led by the brothers Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarssons, both sons of the semi-legendary Ragnar Lodbrok. They were also accompanied by their sibling Ubba, and, according to the Nordic sagas, there was also Bjorn, Ragnar's eldest son. Sort of like a little family holiday, really. Lovely. Now, be warned that from this point onward there are going to be plenty of spoilers for the series Vikings and the Last Kingdom, and we don't want to start getting hate mail because we ruined the fun. We're not the Crown. But we will be happy if you tell us what you think of this video in the comments. We read them all. Back to our story. The massive Viking army disembarked in East Anglia and offered a deal to its king, Edmund. He would provide the Vikings with horses, and in exchange he would get to keep his head. King Edmund was quite attached to his head, so he accepted the deal, and Ivar and Ubba marched the army north towards Northumbria, seeking to topple its rulers, who at that time were two kings, Osberht and Ælle, squabbling over the land. In the year 866, the Vikings conquered the city of Jorvik, or York, and this was the beginning of the Kingdom of Jorvik, derived from their name for York, where they placed Ecgberht I as a puppet ruler, and not a fun puppet like Kermit, but a bad puppet like those ones from the Dark Crystal. That finally got the attention of kings Osberht and Ælle, who combined their armies to try and retake the city. Unfortunately, by that time it was too little too late, and both kings were swiftly defeated, captured, and, as you can probably imagine, we're talking about the Vikings here, executed.
They're not human, they're brutal.
But in fact, this wasn't just another normal Viking killing, this was personal. You see, the reason why the brothers Halfdan and Ivar wanted to attack Northumbria in the first place was to get revenge against King Ælle, because he was supposed to have killed their dad, that semi-mythical Ragnar Lodbrok, several years earlier by casting him into a pit of vipers. Cool. And a bloody revenge they certainly took. According to some accounts, Ælle suffered a form of torture called the Blood Eagle, whereby his ribs were severed from the spine with a knife and then his lungs were pulled through the opening to create a pair of wings. Again, Vikings.
That sounds awful!
This is a reconstruction of what ancient York looked like back then, according to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. In it we can see the ruins of the Roman theatre, the royal hall where the king lived, the East Anglia Tower, or rather what was left of it from Roman times when it was part of a fortress, and of course York Cathedral, built around the year 750, after the previous one burned down. By the way, a big thank you to Marcelo Rojas, who captured these sequences for us.
You're the best!
Over time, the Viking settlements in this region began to prosper, and eventually the Anglo-Saxons and Danes intermixed quite a bit, both genetically and linguistically. In fact, many modern English words come from Old Norse and Danish, including egg, knife, husband, and fog. The cities of York, Lincoln, and Norwich became big centres of trade, and their commercial links extended through the Baltic Sea, reaching all the way to Kievan Rus. And now for a brief and unusual side note. What you see here is the Lloyds Bank Corporalite. If you're thinking, what's that piece of shit? Well, it's exactly that. The largest sample of fossilised human excrement ever found. It was unearthed in York and is thought to have been produced around this time, but that is not certain. Nobody volunteered to carbon date it. It's a whopping 20 centimetres long, nearly 8 inches, so it's safe to say that the Viking who produced it must have felt very relieved afterwards.
I have famously huge turds.
And now let's put that crap behind us, see what I did there, and get back to the story. The neighbouring kingdom of Bamborough, with its capital at the city of the same name, managed to maintain its independence to a certain extent, but at the cost of paying a tribute to the Vikings. Back then, this payment in exchange for peace and safety was called the Danegeld. Nowadays we call it extortion, or taxes, depending on who's doing it. At that time, the Danes of the Great Heathen Army began a series of campaigns to conquer all the Anglo-Saxon territory.
A mob of tired, hungry Vikings.
East Anglia was the first to fall in 869. It is told that Ivar and Ubba tortured King Edmund to make him renounce his Christian religion, but that he refused and so was eventually riddled with arrows and decapitated. After his death, East Anglia was controlled by the Vikings, who then proceeded to launch an attack on the Kingdom of Mercia, ruled by King Ecgberht. They took the city of Nottingham quite easily, and since they were doing so well, told their friends back home to come join the party. That was when a new Viking horde arrived, the Great Summer Army, commanded by Bagsec. This force joined the previous heathen troops, and together they took over a large part of Mercia, where they placed the puppet king Æthelwulf II in charge. If you've seen The Last Kingdom, it's this old geezer here who's about to conquer it. At this point, the Danes began to set their sights on the biggest prize around, which was Wessex, and this is where these two powerful sides clashed, as the invaders came up against a fierce resistance, led by the ruler of Wessex we mentioned earlier, King Æthelred I. He gained some initial victories, like the Battle of Ashdown in 871, where his younger brother Alfred helped him to defeat the great heathen army headed by Halfdan and Bagsac, with the latter dying on the battlefield. Still, after having a great run, it seems that the Saxon king was wounded, fighting against Halfdan at the Battle of Meriton, and he eventually died from these wounds. Or maybe from something else, it's not very clear.
All good things must come to an end.
Regardless, the key point is that his son Æthelwold did not succeed him as king, because he was still a small boy, not like in the TV series where he is depicted as a young drunkard. Instead, the crown went to Æthelred's brother Alfred, who later became known as Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great became King of Wessex in 871. His main headache was still the great heathen army, so he decided to literally buy some time, paying them to leave Wessex alone and go and harass someone else instead. The Vikings took Alfred's money and went on to attack what was left of Mercia. They had managed to take over the eastern part of the kingdom, and there they created some Viking settlements, the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw: Lincoln, Stamford, Nottingham, Derby, and Leicester. After this, the great heathen army split into two. Halfdan travelled north, where he was crowned as the first Viking ruler of the region, which up until then had been known as Northumbria and thereafter as Jorvik. But while the name of the region may have changed, the neighbouring enemies were still the same, so Halfdan spent most of his time fighting against the Picts, Scotai and the Britons of Strathclyde, until he died shortly afterwards, during an internal conflict between two Viking factions. What happened was that Halfdan wanted to travel to Dublin to be crowned as King of Ireland as well, but the local Vikings living there objected to his plan, and so they resolved the dispute Viking style at the Battle of Strangford Lough, where Halfdan was killed.
We're Vikings. We don't run from a fight.
Meanwhile, the remaining half of the heathen army, led by Guthrum, controlled the southern part of the Danish territory, right next to Wessex. Inevitably, these two forces ended up clashing, specifically at the Battle of Wareham in 876, where the Vikings were victorious. Alfred the Great of Wessex began to lose territory little by little, but he also had some victories, like at the Battle of Kynwit in 878, where the Saxons managed to kill Ubba, the last remaining son of Ragnar. Then, on the 6th of January of the year 878, while the court of Wessex was at Chippenham, perhaps drunkenly celebrating Epiphany, Guthrum and his Vikings launched a surprise attack. King Alfred managed to escape miraculously and take refuge in the marshes of the region of Somerset, specifically in a tiny village called Athelney. From this new base, Alfred began to recruit an army among the population to keep fighting the Vikings. He then launched a fierce attack which resulted in the Battle of Eddington, or Ethendun, of 878, where Alfred won a great victory. The Vikings ran back to their fortresses to regroup, but Alfred followed them and laid siege to it, and after 2 weeks they had to surrender. The defeated Guthrum was brought before Alfred the Great and forced to accept defeat, make peace and convert to Christianity, taking the new name Athelstan. The Treaty of Wedmore also set out the new border that would separate Wessex from the Viking territories, which were named Danelaw, the land under Danish law.
It's a clever name.
But Alfred knew that this peace was just a temporary situation, so he focused on preparing the Kingdom of Wessex for possible future wars, creating a part-time army, the Fyrd, building a fleet and constructing almost 30 walled citadels known as burhs. Here we can see a map showing the burhs that were built during this period. Some of the most important were the one at Hastings in the southern region, and the one at Portchester, which was close by. We also have the burhs of Exeter in modern-day Devon, and Worcester near the Welsh border. Oxford also had a fortress, which would later leave its place to the famous university, and nearby, between Oxford and London, was the fort of Aylesbury, which was the capital of the Mercians led by Æthelred II, subject and son-in-law of Alfred, who we will talk about in a minute. Other notable forts were the one at Eashing in the southern part of Wessex and also the one at Buckingham, nothing to do with the royal palace of the current rulers. Lastly, there was another important burh in Southwark in the south part of London, a city which, incidentally, was conquered by Alfred in 886 and renamed Londonburg. After the conquest, the city was reformed, particularly the defensive walls, and began to rise in importance, eventually becoming the modern capital of the country. This conquest went to Alfred's head, and he proclaimed himself king of all Anglo-Saxons.
It's a meaningless title.
As a side note, one small detail that bothers me from this reconstruction of the city, created for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, that you are seeing now, is that massive aqueduct dividing the city, since as far as I know, it never existed. Other similar reconstructions we have shown previously definitely don't feature it. What they do feature is the Great Roman Amphitheatre, next to Cripplegate Ward and Gate. Moving towards the city centre, we find the old Roman Forum, which at that time was used as a market. And moving south on the banks of the River Thames, we find the Governor's House, which later became the residence of the city's rulers. The game features a cool mission in which we have to investigate the murder of one such governor inside the palace. We also have the Temple of Sulis Minerva and the town of Londonwig, in what today is Covent Garden, where it seems there was a notable church or abbey. Lastly, further south, we have Westminster, the future site of the British Parliament and Buckingham Palace. Another very important city back then was Winchester, previously known as Venta Belgarum, which was the political heart of the kingdom and thus housed the residence of the King of Wessex. Here we must highlight Old Minster Church, built some centuries earlier in 660 by King Kenwell. During this time it was converted into a sumptuous cathedral where several Wessex monarchs were buried. Naturally, King Alfred lived in a palace, well, like a king. But unfortunately we have no idea what it looked like. The existing records only say that it was luxurious. It appears that sometime later, around 901, a new cathedral was built right next door, and so that one was called New Minster. And then we have Nunnaminster, or St Mary's Abbey, a Benedictine nunnery which is also featured in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, even though the game is supposed to take place before it was built. Lastly, it is worth mentioning the Lochburn, a drainage and sewer system that still exists and remarkably was in operation until the 19th century. Now let's get back to the action. After an interregnum, during which the land of Jorvik was kingless for 6 years, Guthred took the throne in 883. He featured prominently in the second season of The Last Kingdom, where he is shown to be Christian, but the truth is that nobody really knows for certain. In fact, very little is known for certain about this guy. A few years later, in 886, Æthelred II became ruler of Mercia and married Princess Æthelwulf of Wessex, the daughter of Alfred the Great and his wife Elswith. And this meant that the Kingdom of Mercia, which had been in steady decline for a while, became subject to Wessex.
I own you.
Æthelred and Æthelflaed had a daughter, Elfwin, who is considered to be the last ruler of Mercia. This was mainly thanks to King Alfred, who was a deft statesman and dedicated considerable effort to combining the institutions and legal codes of both territories in order to unify the kingdom. After the year 891, new waves of Norse invaders began to arrive in England. One of these groups was led by the famous Viking Hastin, who fought several battles against Wessex, including the Battle of Farnham in 893. But Alfred had established strong defences that broke up the Viking army, and the invaders were pushed east to Essex. Eventually, the remainders of that force returned home in 896, or became integrated into the Danelaw.
We kicked your asses!
Now that Wessex finally appeared to be secure, Alfred the Great dedicated the last years of his life to culture. He founded schools and filled his court with erudite men from all over the land who translated important works and also wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a collection of annals detailing the history of the first English kings. Alfred the Great eventually passed away in 899 and was succeeded by his son, Edward the Elder. Now, it's not that he was like Benjamin Button. Back then Edward was a young man and the elder bit came many years later. In any case, what we need to know is that his reign got off to a rocky start because his cousin, Athelwold, son of Æthelred I, the elder brother of Alfred the Great, tried to claim the throne after the death of his uncle, and conquered the symbolically important estate of Winborne in Dorset. Edward marched there with his army and challenged him to settle a problem man to man, but his cousin, who had previously declared that he would live or die at Wimborne, soiled himself and fled in the middle of the night, seeking the protection of the Danish King Eric of East Anglia. Æthelwold and Eric then fought Edward at the Battle of the Home in 902. Although the Danes actually won the day, both Eric and Æthelwold died during the fight.
That sounds an awful lot like defeat.
This put an end to the family feud, but the Danelaw problem still remained. That led to the Battle of Tettenhall in 910, where Wessex and Mercia fought against the Viking kings of Northumbria, two guys known as Eowils and Halfdan. No, not Halfdan Ragnarssons, he was still dead. This was a different Halfdan. The Vikings lost the battle and their kings were killed, leaving a power vacuum in Northumbria, which was eventually filled by Irish Viking rulers. Edward then allied with his sister, Æthelflaed, now a widow and in single control of Mercia, and thus considered to be the first woman to fully rule an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Together, the siblings began to take over some Danish lands, and by 913 they had conquered Essex. Then in 918, Æthelflaed died and Edward annexed Mercia as well, including the Danish part, which had belonged to Æthelflaed's heir, his own niece, Ælfwine. With this, all the land south of the Humber estuary became part of the Kingdom of Wessex. Perhaps the reason why King Edward wanted a lot of land was because he had a big family, including 3 wives and 14 children. And those are just the official ones, but you can be sure that there were plenty of illegitimate ones too.
How many women? How many children?
Some of the daughters he had with his second wife Ælflaed were married off to other powerful European kings and nobles, while 3 of his sons became kings, of which the most important was his firstborn Æthelstan. More about him in a minute. Before that, we need to talk about a significant event which took place in 911. Over on the mainland, the Frankish kings were also fed up of suffering constant Viking raids, so King Charles the Simple of West Francia made a deal with a Viking chief named Rollo. In exchange for loyalty and protection, Charles named him Duke of a region in the northern part. Rollo was also made to convert to Christianity and marry Gisela, a possibly illegitimate daughter of King Charles, and thus began the first dynasty of Normans, or Northern Men, who later lent their name to the region of Normandy, which will come up in future episodes. For now, all you need to know is that these Vikings adapted very quickly to the culture of West Francia, started to speak ancient French, and became Christians.
I would advise every single one of them to convert to Christianity immediately.
From the year 920, we must highlight the Welsh king Hywelvar, or Hywel the Good, who unified the 2 petty kingdoms of Dafod and Sisechel to create the new kingdom of Deheubarth. Despite being a bellicose guy, Hywel managed to maintain good relations with Wessex and also created an important set of laws.
I am the law.
Meanwhile, Edward the Elder passed away in the year 924 and was succeeded by his son Athelstan, who we mentioned earlier. This king married off his sister Edith to the Danelaw king, Sitric, to seal a non-aggression pact. But then Sitric died in 927 and Athelstan wasted no time in conquering the city of York. Amazingly, in a matter of months, he was able to annex all the former Viking lands and take over Danelaw.
That's unbelievable. Unbelievable.
To celebrate his accomplishment, Athelstan stopped using the title of King of the Anglo-Saxons and instead proclaimed himself King of the English. This was the birth of the Kingdom of England.
And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.